Welcome to the Energetic Psyche, a weekly podcast hosted by yours truly, Dr. Adrian Campbell. This week, for episode 32, I have Karmen Bennett with me to share her journey through life as a spiritual teacher and speaker, how co-creating with spirit led her into her work as a therapist specializing in childhood trauma, and her current focus on the intersection of spirituality and therapy. I hope you enjoy. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and welcome to the Energetic Psyche. This is a weekly podcast hosted by yours truly, Dr. Adrian Campbell. And this week for episode 32, I have Karmen Bennett with me to share her journey through life as a spiritual teacher and speaker, how co-creating with spirit led her into her work as a therapist, specializing in childhood trauma, and her current focus on the intersection of spirituality and therapy. And I want to tell you guys a little bit about Karmen. Karmen is a mother of two small children, a wife, a poet, a mystic, intuitive healer, and, as we've mentioned, a licensed professional counselor. She's also a lifelong spiritual seeker, and over the last 20 years, she's served as a spiritual teacher, advisor, writer, and speaker in different capacities. She also has over 11 years of clinical experience as a mental health therapist and currently works as a clinical supervisor, therapist, and assistant director of a large private mental health counseling practice, Chris Lawrence and Associates. Karmen also writes for the Daily Word, a Unity publication. So, Karmen, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Yes, thank you, Adrian. I'm so excited to be here.
So, why don't we get started with a little bit more about you? I always love to kind of explore where my guests come from, what their beginnings were like, and kind of where their path started so we can better understand where it went.
Sure. Yeah. Well, how far back do you want to go?
Where are you from? Where you come from?
Well, I'm live in Columbia, Missouri. I have lived here for, 30 years now. So I've been here for a while.
Little while, yeah.
I did move around quite a bit as a child. So I think once we settled here, I was like, yeah, I'm good with moving. I don't need to do that anymore. So
Yeah.
yeah. And are you wanting to know just kind of how more about me in terms of like what led me to the work that I'm doing now?
Well, sure. Yeah. So you moved around as a kid. You moved here 30 years ago and decided to kind of stay, right? And did you go straight from high school into mental health work or?
I did not.
Right. So
Yeah.
let's hear about that.
Yeah. So I think my path to working in the mental health field is a little different, maybe. I mean, I know there's a lot of different paths you can take,
Right.
so maybe it's not so different. I do want to share just a little anecdote because I think it is relevant and just kind of an interesting little tidbit that when I was a child, one of my favorite shows was Full House. I'm sure many people are aware of that show. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, so that was, a very popular show at the time. And when I was probably, I don't know, 7, 8 years old, there was an episode of Full House where one of the children went through like a traumatic experience and ended up going to see a play therapist.
Mm.
And I remember very distinctly in that moment, just like having this sense of, I want to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just kind of tucked that away for a really long time because I had another love, which is writing, that I just was really set on pursuing as my area of study in college. So when I went to undergrad, I ended up getting a BFA in creative writing. So really not much to do with mental health. But I always kind of had that in the back of my head, like, oh, would also really love to be a play therapist, work with children. And after I graduated with my BFA, I mean, as you can imagine, that's not the kind of degree that you just go out and like you get a job, right?
Right. Right.
So after working just random jobs for several years after I graduated, I just really felt like I need to find a career that is fulfilling to me and working with children as a therapist was really the only other thing that I have ever really felt called to do. So it was at that point that I decided to go back to school and get my master's in counseling. I did have to take a few, undergrad courses in psychology, of course, to do that. But yeah, so that I didn't graduate with my master's degree for about 6 years after I got my bachelor's degree. So I took a little bit of a break there.
So I'll tell you, it's kind of funny because I remember when I was a kid talking to my dad, and I mean like a little, probably 5, 6 years old. And, it was the question of like, what do you want to be when you grow up? Mm-hmm. And I remember saying, I want to be a scientist. And he was an engineer and a chemist. So he was super stoked about that. And I was like, I want to be a scientist that studies people. I want to know why people do what they do. I want to study people. And I remember him telling me, oh, honey, I don't think a job like that exists. I don't think that's a job. And I like tucked it away, right? And then went on to like teaching was always my thing. And then after the military, I don't know, it's a whole nother podcast episode. But I remember when I finally went into grad school, long winding path, I had that memory popped up and I was like, oh my God, I did always know, right? But like I was little. I didn't know how to explain like what I was trying to go after.
Yes.
Yeah. It's funny because I think young us, before we get all the layers of societal expectations, cultural expectations, et cetera, our families' expectations piled on top of us, I think we really have a pretty good idea of who we are. Absolutely. And what our purpose is in the world.
Yes.
And then it gets skewed, over time. And I think like you and I are probably some of the lucky ones that found our way back.
Right. Yeah. And even though I didn't initially go into this field, I still chose to pursue something that I was really passionate about that a lot of people probably thought, well, that's a pretty bad decision, like that doesn't make any sense. But I mean, I have no regrets about it because I was doing what you said in terms of like listening to what I knew was true for me and where I was being called.
And it all contributes. I mean, like I dropped out of college to join the Coast Guard because I wanted to travel. That was all. I just wanted to travel. And it was like, this looks like a good ticket. And like, I was almost disowned for it. Like my family was totally not down. And a lot, you could look at my resume and be like, what the heck? Like, you were in the military, you worked in semiconductors, geophysics, like blah, 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 blah. But all of that has contributed to the work I do now in one way or another. And I think that as long as you're following like your heart, right? And you're doing that inner listening, even if it's not, and I even hate to say where you end up, because I think moving along and bouncing around is a much more natural human thing than being like, this is your job for the rest of your life, right? But it does. I mean, it adds up into who we are as a person. And like, because of these varied experiences, like you can offer your clients a different experience than like the therapist next door, it makes all of us very unique.
Yes, for sure. And interestingly, I found that there actually really is a pretty strong connection between like my relationship with language and symbols and metaphor and the work that I do, especially with kids, but with adults too.
I'm a Jungian lady. You don't have to tell me.
Right, exactly. Yes, So yeah, I mean, I like with children, play is all symbolic. It, and there's so many metaphors that arise in that work. And so it is just interesting how you think, there's no connection there, but of course there is. And I believe that nothing is an accident or a waste. Like they're all for something,
Well, and in writing, oh my goodness gracious, especially well, fiction and nonfiction, there's character analysis,
Right. That's
fleshing out who the person is, and not just like the things they say, but what, their mannerisms, the way they move through the world, the things that they do. And so just the understanding required to be a writer, a good writer, and have full fleshed out characters would completely enhance your ability to have strong interpersonal connections with others.
yeah, such a good point. Yeah.
That's awesome. Okay, so did you start out moving into childhood therapy, or where did you start after you got your master's?
I again, not a super linear path. After I graduated, I I did a little bit of spiritual counseling. And I really didn't work in the mental health field for probably 2 years after I graduated. I know part of what we were going to talk about today is, that co-creating with spirit and how that led me here. And I think I had a very clear sense of the type of place that I wanted to work.
Mm-hmm.
And I was not willing to go and work somewhere that didn't feel like the right fit. And so it really was a matter of waiting until that right and perfect opportunity presented itself. So I did just some work, spiritual counseling with youth in my church. And then I started working actually at the practice that I'm at now. And that was about a little over 11 years ago. So I have
Nice.
been here since. But when I did start working in, well, I mean, even as a spiritual counselor, I was working with teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as I started working toward like my license, I immediately went into working with children.
Nice.
Yeah.
Awesome. So what types of technique do you use? I know you mentioned play therapy,
Yeah.
but if you could just explain more of like the details and nuances of what that is, what a session looks like.
Sure. Yeah. So play therapy, I believe in non-directive child-centered play therapy. So that basically means that the child is leading the session. I'm not coming in there and saying, okay, we're going to work on this thing today. Now, obviously, every individual is different. And so I'm going to change my approach to meet the needs of the individual. So there might be times when I need to be a bit more directive or have a specific, activity that we're going to do. But non-directive child-centered play therapy really looks like being in a playroom with a child. So we have a playroom that's set up with, all the standard toys, dolls, and play food and puppets and all of those things, art supplies. And the way that I typically explain it to parents is that, adults process verbally.
Mm-hmm.
So they will use language to express their thoughts, their feelings, and to work through whatever it is that they came to work on in therapy. But for children, play is their language. So a child is really doing the work through their play. So for somebody else that's observing a play therapy session, it's going to look like a kid is playing.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And my role as the therapist is to be fully engaged and, of course, to follow the child, to, track what the child is doing. And the way that I gauge if what we're doing is working
Mm-hmm.
is kind of looking at the themes of the play, the intensity of the play, how that's looking week to week. If a child is coming in every week and doing the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
that is telling in and of itself.
Right.
And looking at the intensity behind their play, you can get a sense for are they just playing or are they like actively processing something. And so for, that might be dramatic play where we are actually like acting out a scene or, playing out a story. It might be the child playing in a sand tray. There's a whole other.
I was just going to ask if you have a sand tray, because
Yes.
I am so enamored with them.
Yes, love sand tray. Again, the symbols and the metaphors, and yeah, I have a little bit of training in like a Jungian based play, sand play technique, which is super fascinating. But so with play therapy, it really looks like a child is playing. I also do EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and I use that with kids as well. And so I might.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So
especially, sorry, I didn't mean to get you up. Well, because like EMDR works on rewiring neural pathways.
Yes.
And so doing it on a developing brain, right, is almost like working with central nervous system training or conditioning at a young age.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I find that children, I mean, obviously it depends on their history, their experiences. But generally speaking, I see a lot more movement in my children in terms of discharging. They tend to get better.
Yeah. I was just thinking with a brain that's still developing and still so flexible, I bet it would move quicker.
Yes.
That makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. I also think part of it is just the lack of inhibition and self-consciousness that adults might bring into, because a kid is gonna, I mean, it's play therapy is a very somatic therapy.
Yeah.
Because it's fully embodied and they are reworking things through their bodies and how they're being, right? So for play therapy is great for adults too, but a lot of adults aren't going to do that because
I think with adults we call dance therapy. We call play therapy dance therapy, or we call play therapy like, do you know anything about authentic movement? Yeah. Well, so it's basically allowing your body to move in whatever way that it wants to. And there's a witness there to hold space and reflect, right?
Oh, that's awesome.
And so we do play therapy too. We just call it more serious things.
Right. Yes. Yes, that is very, very true. Yeah. But that's so interesting because that is also part of what my work looks like with kids, especially if they have experienced a traumatic event, is asking them, what does your body want to do?
Right.
And then giving them the space to do that. And yeah, it's beautiful.
So what ages do you typically work with?
I work with kids as young as 3. And I also work with adults. So I don't tend to work with older population very much, so probably like 3 to 60 is kind of the average age range of my clients. Yeah.
And teenagers?
Yes, I do.
I have a 14-year-old nephew. And I've had many calls with my sister recently where I'm like, he's 14, man.
Yeah.
14, just write it out.
That's right. That's so funny. I have a nephew who will be 14 in just a few months, so I can relate.
Yeah. And she's like, and I will send her every reel I can find online. I'm like, see, it's not just you.
Right.
It's not just you.
Oh my goodness. Yes. Teenagers can be hard. And I feel like you have to really want to work with teens to do good work with teens.
Yes. I tell him often that he's lucky I love him so much. But that's cool.
Teenagers can be difficult in what I was just talking about with adults is like, but it's more of like, nah, I'm not going to do that. Like, I'm too cool for that,
Well, and they're very self-centered at that point. And I don't say that in a mean or a derogatory way, but I remember in grad school, one of the classes we went through was talking, it might have been neuroscience. No, probably something developmental. Anyway, but it was talking about how the brain at that point of your life in development is literally facing itself. Like your perception at that point is you're perceiving yourself more than you are others. So everything that happens in your life has to do with you. like everything. And I just remember like learning that and being like, oh my God, makes so much makes sense right now.
Yeah.
They can't help it. They just can't help it. It's just the way their brains are at, where they're at right now. But yeah. So what made you decide to work with kids?
I think it's partly just kind of having that sense that that's what I was gonna do, and that's what I was supposed to do. I've always just felt really connected to kids. Kids have always seemed to, like if I'm out in public, like a kid is gonna find me, So
I'm like that with dogs.
Right. I was gonna say, I know a lot of people are like that with animals, but yeah, kids. And also I think, it's that can't remember exactly what the quote is, but it's something about like being what you needed as a child.
Yeah.
So I think it's just healing and for me to be able to support kids through whatever it is that they are dealing with.
Yeah. And, I find that a lot of us, so I'm not currently a therapist, right? I do research but I'm a coach. I've been working with people for 10 years now, over 10 years now. And I'm probably going back to school next year.
Really?
Yeah, to become a therapist.
Wow.
I haven't finalized my decision. I'm waiting until I get back from my Italy trip, but
wow.
Chances are pretty high. Yeah, and I find myself drawn. I mean, all of my research and everything I work with is military and first responder community because that's where I've seen so much trauma. And, my own childhood wasn't great either. But I'm also not a huge kid person. I'm not going to lie. Like I said, the dogs find me, not the kids.
Yes.
And if the kids do find me, it's usually because I have my dogs. That's about it. But yeah, I find that a lot of us in the helping services, we are drawn to places where we have seen or experienced trauma, especially when we've had to work through it and heal it, because we know how it hurts.
Right.
And we want to keep others from having to feel that.
Absolutely.
Right? And I think that there's something about that makes us so much better at our job because we know how much it hurts. Like there's a lot of veterans I've talked to, and I have a little bit of LEO experience, law enforcement, first responder. And, they'll tell me like, they like talking to me because I have that experience, because I have been in their shoes,
right.
And there's an unconscious, I think, connection that takes place that smooths the pathway. And even with kids, you know what I mean? Even as we get older, if they're experiencing something that we've been through, or even if it's, something that we can identify from a level of hurt, there is an unconscious connection that just happens a lot easier, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And, the beautiful thing too is I'm working with children regardless of the age of the person that I'm working with.
Right.
I'm still working with the child because I do work with childhood trauma.
Yes.
And so it doesn't matter if the person sitting in front of me is an adult, we're still working with the child and healing those wounds.
Yep. Because, I don't know if you know this or not, but Freud and Jung were besties back in the day, right? And then they had a breakup.
Right.
And one of the big points that they broke up over is that Freud was really stuck in that, like, all of your issues stem from your childhood. Like, that's where it comes from. And Jung was like, no. There's so much more shit that's going to mess you up. Like, it's not all from that. But Freud honestly was brilliant in so many ways. Like, he had a lot of issues. It was late, 1800s, early 1900s. And he was often mistranslated by the English translators. So people think that his stuff was all about sex.
Right.
But for him, the word libido is actually mostly related to energy, not sexual necessarily energy. Anyway, I really do think that he had a good point when he was talking about how much our developmental years impact us.
Yeah.
I don't believe it's the only thing, hence being a youngin,
Right.
but there are so many things that we just move past, ignore, push through. And a lot of what happened in our childhood becomes automatic processing, gets owned by the unconscious, and
Mm-hmm.
we just live our lives without realizing why we do the things we do, why we think the way we think, why we make the choices we make. And then we don't know why our lives are not what we want them to be.
Yeah.
And a lot of it stems from that developmental period in our lives, the early developmental,
Yes.
and that inner child, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the inner child wounds that so many of us have experienced.
Yeah. Yeah. And I see so often a resistance in people to even acknowledge that
Mhm.
their childhood has any impact on their current reality.
Yeah.
It's like,
It's
I
that
don't,
need for control.
yeah, it's like nope, that's not affecting me.
Or I dealt
Uh,
with that. It's over.
but, I mean, healing is cyclical like everything else. And so we continue to
Absolutely.
touch on the same things over and over again. And certainly I agree there are more factors at play.
Mhm.
I try to avoid any kind of like overgeneralization about anything.
Of course.
It's not all about childhood. And, when you're a child, your parents, your family,
Mhm.
your school, your community, like those are really big influences on kind of writing on the slate of who you are. And so I think, even if it's not a traumatic childhood, people say, "Oh, I had a good childhood." Like there's nothing there to uncover. Like those
Mhm.
experiences still have a direct impact on who you are today.
Right. And I mean, even from like a coaching space, because I don't deal with heavy trauma,
Mm-hmm.
right? The childhood experiences are so monumental in
Yeah.
who we are because they, like you said, they're foundational,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you can't say that has nothing to do with who I am because it's like that's how you learn to be who you
Right.
are.
Exactly.
And like as a coach, right, my whole thing is like, what is going on in your life and why is it happening? What's serving you? What's not serving you? And a lot of the behaviors, thoughts, beliefs that are not serving them are things they picked up in childhood that they didn't even realize, right? Because they've just become the way that they see the world, the lens they view things through.
Right. And when you're a child, you don't have the lived experience to know that the way that you are experiencing life is not the way that everybody else is experiencing life,
Right.
And so I think we just kind of like, oh, that's just how it is, and we move along.
And just because it was then doesn't mean it has to be now. And maybe it was for your parents, but it's not for you.
Right.
Right. And so it's just being open to explore, like like we're saying, like even if it's not traumatic, just looking at your experience as a child and how that contributes to who you are now,
Yeah. Yeah.
and dealing with that. Yeah. 100% agree.
Yeah. Especially if there's, sometimes people will present to therapy without really knowing why they're here.
Mhm.
And I think sometimes too, looking back at childhood and family of origin and all of that is just helpful when we're really trying to conceptualize like what's going on here.
Mhm.
And I, working with children, I definitely take a developmental approach in how I look at people. So yeah, there are certainly other theories and therapists who maybe don't find that that's super important to talk about or to look at, but i think I think it can really be helpful in supporting people in getting to know themselves, increasing their
Absolutely.
self-awareness. I just think it helps so much to be able to say to people like, this all makes sense.
Right. Right. I was just having a conversation the other day. Maybe it was a random. I don't even remember who, but I was like, sometimes it's just allowing people to understand why it's happening
Yeah.
And just the why can ease the suffering,
Yep.
right? It's
So
not even, there's a book called The Nature of Suffering. I read it in grad school and I was like, anyone that works with human beings in any capacity needs to read this book
okay.
and it was written by a medical doctor.
Right that.
But it's all about where our suffering comes from. And it's not about like the chronic pain, and it's not even necessarily about, the psychological disturbances. It is unique and specific and personal to each individual. And in that book, I think is where I read something about that, where just having an idea of where it's coming from. Like they've actually done studies on people with chronic pain, for example. When we can explain why they're in pain, it reduces their level of suffering.
Yeah, for sure. That makes
Mm-hmm.
complete sense to me. Yeah. Because I see that as being, I mean, it's one of my favorite parts of therapy is when I have somebody in my office who doesn't understand
Right.
how these things have affected them, and to be able to really connect those dots for them, but
Mm-hmm.
also to offer that compassion and witnessing of like, I see you and you make sense.
Right.
And there are a lot of people who experience the same thing, um,
My practice is very much a lot of the same. Is just assuring people you're not alone and what you're going through is normal and makes sense.
yeah, it's huge. Yeah, I feel like it's simple, but it's very powerful.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Because it's our lack of understanding that can create so much of the suffering that we experience.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. So I always tell my clients, I'm like, number one, first thing, awareness.
Yep.
That's the first thing before we do anything else. Let's figure out what is going on.
Yep. Right.
And
We got
then,
to know what's going on. Otherwise,
yeah,
how can
yeah.
how can
And
we
then
change?
we'll go forward. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely. Well, that's awesome. Okay. And so I know that being a therapist isn't your only gig. You also have, you've continued writing, and I know that you are pretty active in your spiritual community as well.
Yeah, I actually haven't been active in my spiritual community as of late.
Okay.
Um, with the pandemic, that I had a baby. Yeah,
Congratulations.
well, that was 3 years ago, but yeah.
Congratulations for making it through. You're
Right.
still here.
Yes, that was my second kiddo. So that definitely got me out of being as active and engaged. I think I'm just kind of in a different season of my life right now. Um, but yes, I have been very active in the spiritual community in terms of serving. That's how I really benefit, I guess. I don't know if that's the right word, but from a spiritual community. I know everybody, is drawn to spiritual community and church and whatnot for different reasons. But for me, it's really about having a place to serve. I find it very important to be using the talents and the gifts that I have been given in service to other people. So,
Absolutely.
um, so yeah, I would love to. I'm looking forward to when I am able to do more of that again. But I do write for the Daily Word, as you mentioned, which is a spiritual publication, and so that is one way that I can still be serving and using my gifts in some
Yeah.
capacity. Yeah.
And you, right? It's for Unity Church, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Do you mind if we talk about Unity
Oh
for
yeah.
a
Oh,
minute?
love that.
Okay. Because so I grew up Catholic and left the church and went my own way and studied a lot of religions and came up to my own conclusions, which is basically like, well, they're basically all the same. Just don't be an asshole. Like, love people, and
That on
like,
a pillow.
I just kind of came to my own space of I'm just going to love people. Like, I'm just going to show up as love in the world and do the best I can every day to be that.
Mhm.
And I have other people in my life who are Christian, and I've had clients too that have struggled with wanting to maintain a Christian faith, but finding a lot of Christian churches to be really suffocating,
Mm.
or, forcing the concept of sin, down your throat and all of that jazz. And I stumbled into Unity, well, a few years back, at
Okay.
least. Honestly, the first time I heard about it was, do you know Deb from Heart, Body, and Soul?
I know of her. I don't know her.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so she's one of the owners, and she mentioned going to Unity. And so I mentioned it to my sister, and we have gone a few times. And it was just such a warm and loving environment. And when I was in Sedona, my partner at the time was looking for a church. And I said, well, I'm not going to any of those. I tried a couple, and I was like, I can't. I said, when I leave, I'm just, not feeling great. And so we would drive all the way to Sedona to go to a Unity church. It was an hour and a half drive. But I loved the speaker, and I've just always found it to be such a different style of Christian. And like the one here in Columbia has a meditation sit once a
Yeah.
week, right?
Yeah. So I'm not sure exactly like what all Unity is offering right now, but they also have Show Me Dharma, which is in the same building.
That's what I'm thinking
Yeah.
of. Yeah. But just the fact that they, share space
Right. Yes.
is beautiful.
Yes. And they're, I mean, very, I would say, closely aligned in their mission.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I did not grow up with church, and my family didn't go to church, so I didn't receive any kind of religious upbringing, conditioning, anything like that. um, but I always felt really interested in church because of the spiritual aspect, and I always felt a connection just to Jesus as an individual, even though I had no affiliation with the Christian church. And so I was trying to find a place. I would go to church with some of my friends, and it never felt good. Just
Hmm.
like you said, I never felt good being in any of those spaces. And it wasn't until my dad actually is the one in my family who found Unity and started going there. And it wasn't until I also started attending and just learning about Unity that I was like, okay, this really resonates with me, because it's a metaphysical,
Yes.
mm, a, you know um, teaching. Like, it's not looking at things literally, and it's
Mhm.
it's very practical. It wasn't even founded to be a church like most spiritual practices. It's
Yeah.
not meant to be a church. It's really meant to supplement whatever your religious or spiritual beliefs are.
Mm.
And I think that's why it fits well with so many different people, because it's not a dogma that's like so exclusive that you
Mm.
can't have other beliefs.
Well, and like the metaphysical component, there was a guest speaker recently. I think he's normally up in Chicago, and he was down at the Unity in Columbia.
Mhm.
Fantastic speaker. But he was sharing about the metaphysical, looking at the Bible metaphysically, and not in like I think people hear the term metaphysical and they're like, ooh, like dream catchers and crystals and
Right.
woo woo. But it is more about looking at the Bible through a metaphorical lens, right?
Absolutely.
And taking full value from the stories that are shared and really exploring them from that angle. And the way he talked about it, it was really lovely. And I think there are so many beautiful stories in the Bible. if we can look at them through that metaphorical lens,
Yes.
right? I think it opens it up to so many more people. And just like we were talking about metaphors earlier, you know, like when we allow metaphor to exist and we look at things through images and symbols, we create more possibility and opportunity versus rigidity and like the black and white, you know?
Yes. And even, I mean, language is so limiting.
Mhm.
And I think that the metaphysical view is just, spirituality just lends itself more to that, right? Because it's so far beyond what our brains can understand that when we try to put it into language, like we're
Yeah.
really missing it, you know? And so we're really all just doing the best that we can to describe things that are really outside language. And images are more of the language of spirit. And so
Absolutely.
looking at the symbols, I think just makes more sense. And it also applies for me. I have found, anyways, I know everybody has a different experience, right? And that's the beauty of it, is that there's not a right or a wrong here. But for me, I find it much more applicable to my own life when I look at it through a metaphysical lens, because then it does open it up. It's not so restricted to this specific story in time. It's like, no, this actually applies to me in 2024 right now, you know?
Mhm.
So
Because I think image and metaphor like used, it creates opportunities for more people to connect to the same thing in different ways.
yes.
Right. Like, I mean, just like any image or symbol, like if I say, you know, a flame, what does that mean to you? It's
Mhm.
going to have a different representation for you than it is for me, than it is for, you know, Dan, Bob, Jim, Sarah down the road. And so I think by moving into those stories in the Bible through metaphor allows people to have their own personal connection with what's going on.
Yes. And I think that's really the way it's meant to be, you know? I find that people really want to be told
Yeah.
what to do, how to do it, you know, like this, do ABC. And especially with developing your own spirituality, spiritual practices, your own relationship with the divine, it's going to be just as unique as any other relationship.
Mhm.
It's not going to look the same, and spirit is going to communicate with you in ways that make sense to you.
Yeah. Exactly. Because it's your relationship with
Right.
spirit,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, and I know not everyone, you know, feels the same way or believes the same way, and that's fine. You know, I'm not Christian, but I think Jesus is awesome. Like, I'm totally down with Jesus. And I'm definitely, you know, huge when it comes to spirituality. And I have a very strong connection with spirit, and it's mine. And, you know, I work with people across many different religions. And sometimes it's surprising to me that we can work so well together, even speaking from a spiritual space.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's because I really do honor everyone's relationship with God, spirit, whatever you want to call it, as long as it's one that's meaningful for them,
Right.
you know, one that they're choosing
Yes.
and that they're, you know, consciously creating versus being forced into or whatever. I think when we can create a connection like that with spirit, it's just beautiful.
And I think the dogma tends to keep people more separate
Absolutely.
from God or spirit or universe or whatever term you want to use.
Right. Yeah.
And really that's, I mean, like you were saying about Freud and his work being mistranslated, like, hello.
Right. I've had these conversations with my 14-year-old nephew who is, you know, wanting a spiritual life. And he's been really big on like he's been watching some YouTube videos I'm not excited about. Um, some guys talking about the Bible and saying whatever. And I'm like, you realize this could be like some dude in his basement, right? Like, you can't just read this and come up with your own thoughts and like,
Right.
that's the word of God. Like,
Right. Right. Because we know that the gospel was written by people who didn't even live or walk with Jesus, and we also, I think there's just so much information that is out there, but that is left out of that, how Christianity is presented. And, I think that's unfortunate because the information doesn't take away from Christianity. It just enhances it, but yeah, and I think that's why spirituality resonates with me more than religion, because it is about the relationship, and I feel the same way, that I have a very intimate relationship with the divine, and you're not going to get that if you are listening to what other people have to say and not
Right.
that for yourself and figuring out what actually feels true for you.
Exactly. Yep. Human beings do a really good job of mucking stuff up.
So
yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what about your writing? So, you write for the Daily Word. Do you do any other kind of writing still these days?
I write poetry. And I just started writing a book. So
what's it about?
excited about that. I haven't really talked about that to most people, but it's actually a guide for connecting with spirit and developing
Lovely.
with spirit. Yeah.
That is fantastic.
So I'm doing that. But yeah, I write poetry just kind of for my own enjoyment. I used to write a lot of poetry for Unity. Um, but I write a lot of nature-based spiritual poems. And then, yeah, I write for the Daily Word, which for anybody who's not familiar with the Daily Word, it's kind of like a daily devotional. It has every day there is a word, and then there's an affirmation, a message, and a Bible verse that goes with that word.
Oh, that's lovely. How could, if somebody was interested in that, how could they find that?
So you can go, if you just search Daily Word, like, you'll find the website, it'll come up. You can find it through Unity's website. You can, I don't think you can read it online anymore. But you can follow Daily Word on social media. They often will, like, sometimes they'll post the messages. Not always, but you can get a subscription. It's not that expensive. It's 6 issues a year, 2 months per issue. And I think you can do an electronic subscription as well. But if you just go online, you can find it. Or if you go to the Unity in your area, they likely will have copies of that available for sale in the bookstore.
So it's a book then, and it has a page, like...
Yes, it's like a little booklet kind of a thing.
Okay. Yeah. I was thinking like, oh my gosh, I'm feeling less old than normal right now, because I was like, is this like an Instagram thing? I'm like, is this a text I'm gonna get?
This is
no, it's a book.
Still print.
That's awesome.
Yeah, you can hold it in your hand. Yeah. And there's also, usually every issue has a couple articles in it as well. And maybe some extra affirmations too. But so yeah, I get assigned like certain words, and then I write the messages and the affirmations for those.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah, it's really cool because it goes out all over the world, and so it's really awesome to think like that my messages are reaching people. Yeah, it's very, very fulfilling, and I really love that role.
That's fantastic. See, you're like, I'm not really serving right now. Yes, you are. Yes, you are. Just not in a way that, I guess, and not as much as you used to.
Yes, it has changed. That is yes.
Yeah.
And I think I'm serving, or at least I'm moving in a direction maybe of doing more of that service through my work too. So
Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely.
you're right.
Cool. So let's talk about your work because
Yeah.
we're just about at our hour, if you can
Yeah.
possibly believe it. Time flies, I know. So you work at Chris Lawrence and Associates,
Yes.
and do you have openings for clients currently? Do you have a wait list? If
I
someone
do
wanted
have
to see
a
you,
I have
how
a
would they
wait
do it?
list. It's not very long at the moment. Yeah, if anybody was interested in working with me, they could certainly reach out through our website or by calling the office. Doing it through the website is probably the easiest way. CLAcounseling.com is the website, and you can put in a referral and request to work with me if you would like.
And
Um,
that's for Missouri residents only, though,
that
right?
is,
Okay.
yes. Unfortunately, we've not figured that piece out yet. They're with licensure laws.
Mm,
Yeah, I can't see anybody that's not residing in Missouri,
yeah.
unfortunately. Yeah,
It's one of the things that honestly kept me from going into therapy for a very long time. Is
right.
as a coach, I can
Yeah,
work with people all over the country.
yep, yep.
But I'm at a point now where I'm referring out over half of my people to therapy.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
And, I think half of my clients right now are seeing a therapist and me at the same time because
yeah.
stuff
Good.
comes up and I go,
Right.
"Ooh, take that to therapy, write it
Yes,
down."
that's great. Yeah,
Yeah.
love that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
But
hopefully, because they are working to change this. Obviously, the pandemic kind of highlighted that this is an issue, and so they
right.
are they are working on changing that. So hopefully, I don't know, within the next year or so, maybe that won't be the case. But
Really? Like a national
yeah, it's called the
guidance?
Counseling Compact. So yeah, they're working to make this happen. So
Oh my God, that'd be amazing.
crossed. Yeah, I have no idea honestly, like when that will go into effect, but it's in progress right now. So that's
Oh,
that's
that
the
is
thing.
fantastic.
Yeah,
Yeah, because I have a lot of military
yeah.
clients and friends too.
Uh,
They transfer every 3 to 4 years, and so they're having to start over with a new provider every time, and
Bummer.
that's terrible.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, it really is a flaw. So one good thing maybe that will come out of the pandemic is that will be reworked.
Yes. Okay, so awesome. So CLAcounseling.com.
Yep. Hmm. Yep.
Perfect.
Um,
Perfect.
and I obviously work with children, childhood trauma. Also, just really venturing more into working with the spiritual dimension more explicitly and implicitly in my work with clients, and so really wanting to work with people who might be interested in that kind of an approach or are
Mhm.
interested in developing more of a spiritual practice relationship. I would love
Yeah.
to work with people who are interested in that for sure.
I think that's lovely. As a Reiki master, I do a lot of spiritual teaching and mentoring and have had clients as a coach that are working to develop their practice. And I think, therapy and working with therapists is another great space to do that in.
Yeah,
That
absolutely.
a that I think a lot of people just don't think about, right?
Right.
They're
Yeah.
feeling a little lost, they're not sure where to go. If you don't have a church in mind where you can go to a pastor or someone and talk to them, I think a therapist is a really nice, like, intermediary.
Yeah.
Yeah, that can help you get some
Absolutely.
clarity.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
Well, cool, Carmen. I am going to wrap us up, and
Okay.
I always ask one question at the end, and that's if there was one thing that you wanted to share with everyone, what would it be?
Mm. Oh my gosh, gonna put me on the spot.
It's not that crazy. It doesn't have to be that crazy. I promise.
Hmm. Oh, there's so much. I feel like we could probably talk for hours and not cover
One piece of advice.
it. I think I will say that, if there's any part of you that feels a nudge to explore
Mm,
spirituality. Maybe you do have a spiritual practice, but you want to deepen it. Or, if there's any part of you that's like kind of feeling like, oh, I might be interested in that, or feeling a little bit of a call to that, just really encourage people to listen to that, and really in general to listen to that voice,
Yeah.
regardless of what it's about or what it's telling you. Spirit is communicating with you all the time. And I believe that everything is working for our highest good. I know that's a radical thing to say, given the way that things might look and feel, but I truly believe that. And I think developing a spiritual practice and relationship with spirit can help you to have that perspective, and it just really changes how you experience life and really reduces suffering. And I think that's what
Yes.
everybody wants. And so I would just encourage people to listen to themselves, and if you don't hear anything, maybe you need to be quiet.
I love that. Maybe you need to be quiet. Yes.
Because there's a lot of distractions, and
There is.
yeah.
There is. Well, and I think sometimes we get to a point where we hear something we don't want to hear. And so we start talking and we never stop.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, beautifully said.
Thank
Beautifully
you.
said. Yeah. Because I mean, personally, I have found that to be true.
Oh,
That once I got more clear with my connection to spirit and I just listen and tap in,
yes.
like even some of the worst stuff that's come down, it's like, I don't know why this is happening, but I'm going to trust that this is in my highest good somehow. Right.
Exactly.
And then because I have that connection, I know it. Like I have an inner knowing.
Feel that
Yeah.
that's true.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And then
Yeah.
you can transform those experiences
Yeah.
into something that is going to teach you and assist in your growth and healing and further you along on your
Right.
path.
Right.
There's really nothing to fear. People touch on, like you said, they might hear something that they don't want to hear. They might touch on a little bit of, you know, something scary or dark. And it's actually the moving away from it that gives it its power and keeps it scary, because when we
Yep.
move toward it, like, we are actually bringing light to it, and we get to know the thing. And once you know it, it's like what we were talking about before with people, of like just helping them to have a sense of like why things
Yeah.
are the way that they are. When you get to know parts of yourself, you will have compassion.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah.
not as scary as it seems.
Yeah. Well, it's still sometimes scary, but
I
it
mean,
gets
the
it gets
process.
easier the more you do it, I would say. I mean, it's just like when I do dream work, right? And working with nightmares.
Ah,
They're the same thing. I mean, this is shadow stuff, this is scary stuff, right? And the more you pull away and ignore, the louder and bigger it gets.
right,
And so it's finding the courage to face it. And
right.
the more often you do that, the more often you see, like, oh, that's what's back there. Oh,
Yes.
that's what that is. That's what that means.
Yeah, and
Then,
generally what people are scared of are their own feelings.
mhm,
But,
yeah, yeah.
I
The
have found,
parts of themselves that they can't be proud of.
right. Yeah.
Because we
Yeah,
all have them.
absolutely.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that people have so much more capacity than they realize. And
Yes.
yeah, finding somebody that you trust
Right.
to help you through those processes, because yeah, I appreciate you saying, like, yeah, it can be scary, and
Mhm.
having somebody to guide you through that, hold space for that, is so
Right.
important, no matter what that ultimately looks like.
Yep. And that again, I think people overlook therapists in that way, where it's
Mm,
like, well, there's nothing wrong with me. And it's like, there doesn't have to be something wrong with you to go to
right.
therapy.
Yes.
Sometimes it's just like, I don't want to face this alone. And you
Right.
don't have to.
Yeah.
And maybe your friends or family aren't the best person to be on that journey with
Right.
you,
Right.
And so to go to someone that professionally and has experience in holding space,
Yeah.
like that's a very beautiful thing.
Right.
It's a gift.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and I think most people would be surprised to realize that actually therapy is about depathologizing.
Exactly.
We might have to use diagnosis for insurance purposes, but like
Sure.
ultimately, we
Right.
want to depathologize whatever it is that you're experiencing. So,
You're normal.
right.
You are normal. You are
Yes.
fine. You are a beautiful, powerful human being that can do anything you want in this world.
That's
And
right.
you're fine. You're fine.
Yes. So there doesn't have to be anything wrong with you to benefit from.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Oh my gosh. Well, Karmen, this has been a joy. I think we could
Oh,
probably talk for another 3 hours.
this has been lovely. It's been really nice to
Oh,
meet you.
thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I really appreciate you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for allowing me to have this conversation with you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. To everyone out there in Homeland, bye. Have a great week. Thank you so much for joining us on the Energetic Psyche, a weekly podcast that live streams every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I look forward to you joining us in the future. Have a great week.